This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with author Sue Chang. Sue is a Chinese-Canadian writer. She was born and raised in Shanghai and is the daughter of a former and reluctant Red Guard leader, which was the paramilitary arm of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution beginning in the 1960s. Today, we will be talking about her debut novel, The Immortal Woman, published by House of Anansi in March of this year. It has already garnered a lot of attention. If you look at her website, you'll see tons and tons of links to media information and praise from CBC, Indigo Books, and Amazon, to name a few high-powered sources. Join me in welcoming Sue to the podcast.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your show, and so feeling very honored to be here.
Oh, thank you. Well, we are really honored to have you because Tara and I both read your book and really enjoyed it, and we cannot wait to talk to you a little bit about it and let everyone else know if they haven't yet read it. So now I included the information about the Red Guard in your intro because it is a key part of the storyline. And can you tell us a little bit about your novel and how you came to write about that particular subject?
Yeah, sure. So my father was a reluctant student leader, as you said in the introduction. So he was, at the time, Red Guards were comprised of essentially teenagers during the Cultural Revolution. And my father was very young. He was about 15, 16 years old by the end of his tenure. And he was just a kid, and he was using his position to protect his teachers. And as a child growing up, I listened to some of those stories, and I always found them very fascinating because clearly the entire nation was driven into madness by this Maoist ideology. But there were just all those hidden pockets of humanity and kindness in his stories. And I thought that was something you just couldn't hear in or read in our history books or even our fiction books. And even though I was born after the Cultural Revolution, I was born in the early 80s, but I felt my generation was very much impacted by the upheaval of my parents' generation. But at the same time, we were really not allowed to talk about it openly. So we didn't really quite understand what exactly happened other than from these private conversations. So when I immigrated to North America in my early 20s, I just realized I had access to all that tabooed history, whatever I wanted to read. And I became very obsessed with reading about it and understanding it more. So this book is really my attempt to remember what happened and to heal from there.
Yeah. Did your father ever write down or did you ever record his stories or anything like that?
I don't think he really wrote down anything, but we did have a lot of conversations long before this book was in my head. As a child, we talked about what happened. Then I did eventually go back to interview him as well. Once again, it wasn't so much for the book, it was just as oral history for the family to keep. So
Right.
I did do that as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I really love that. Now, an important theme in the novel is the relationship between mothers and daughters because there's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter. And I
Mhm.
just loved that in particular about the story. So, can you talk a little bit about those relationships?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the novel centers on the lives of this pair of Chinese mother and daughter, LeMay and Lin. But yes, there is the grandmother character in the early part of the book as well. So the relationship, especially between LeMay and Lin, is very complicated and it just keeps on evolving as well. So I think one of the deciding factors of their early relationship is really the filial piety, which is a huge part of Confucius teaching. And it's also perhaps the most important moral pillars of traditional Chinese society. As a filial daughter, LeMay just could never leave China because she could not leave her own mother, the grandmother character. So instead, she put all that energy, all her dreams and hopes, perhaps very unhealthy energy, into her daughter Lynn. And in turn, Lynn, the daughter, eventually developed this obsession about America and the West. I think it's also because of her strong desire to please her mother, to save her mother, to do what her mother really wanted but couldn't do herself. But then after Lynn left for America, LeMay obviously became very lonely, and as she aged, she started to change. China was rising rapidly. More importantly, for someone like LeMay who never managed to leave China, decades of increasingly sophisticated propaganda eventually caught up with her as well. And meanwhile, her daughter was becoming very westernized. So the lonely LeMay realized she was losing her only child to a culture she really didn't understand. So I think that caused a lot of tension between the mother and daughter. But I hope it was clear, even as the mother character, LeMay, moved slowly towards nationalism, she always had her doubts as well. I think that young girl we met at the beginning of the book who just loved reading, loved thinking for herself, like having all these critical thinking skills, that character never entirely went away. But she was shifting her position. But sometimes that was also just to be on the opposite side of her daughter, as her desperate attempt to counter her daughter, hopefully pull her daughter towards her own position. So at its core, I think of this book as really about this mother-daughter's inability to communicate with each other, because they were so damaged by their history, and also they were so used to being silenced in their society. So they were not able to communicate, to understand each other, and that's where the source of all these tension occurred.
Yeah, and I have to say that that was such a natural part of the storytelling to me. It felt very real. I think a lot of mothers and daughters can recognize that, but I love that cultural component that it's like you said, it's where they were born, raised, lived, the philosophy they lived under. All of that plays out, but it's also a very accessible story for everybody, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, one of my favorite parts too was when LeMay goes to Canada. I don't remember which. Anyway, North America. We'll just say that because I don't want to
Yeah.
give any spoilers. But North America, and then meets up with Lynn. That whole thing was just so emotional, and it was so beautifully played out. So I love that part of the story. So,
Oh,
and it
thank
really
you.
did show. Yeah, and it really did show that relationship as well, because as any mother daughter, right? There's a lot of push pull
That's right.
naturally.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that's relatable. Even though maybe some people are not situated in this particular cultural context, but they can see themselves a bit.
A-
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think most of us can see that. Yeah. Okay. Now, one of my favorite aspects of the novel, and I apologize because I can't help, especially in the political climate we're in now, but as everyone knows, I'm in the US. But it's this notion that the US is seen by many immigrants as the shining beacon on the hill, or the American dream, and that other countries, because we have this exceptionalism here in this country,
Mhm.
other countries fail by comparison. I don't want to give any spoilers, but you push back on that myth, and I loved that about the book. That was one of my strongest feelings about it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Like you said, from today's vantage point, given the current political environment and the increasing sort of aggression against international students and foreign nationals, I think more and more people are viewing this notion that U.S. is just a shining beacon on a hill as a myth.
Exactly.
But I wrote this book 5 years ago, and I was really reflecting the sentiment of urban Chinese between late 80s and early 2000s. So the sentiment back then had perhaps more to do with what happened in China in the preceding decades. So we know the Maoist revolution lasted until the mid to late 70s, and shortly after, a kind of ready mindset to admire, even worship the West, especially America, emerged. because I think Chinese lives became physically and mentally eviscerated by decades of political trauma. More and more people were becoming disillusioned by the official ideology in the 80s and 90s. And their first instinct would be to reckon with the trauma. But there was also ongoing oppression that demanded collective amnesia. So that made healing impossible. So, in their despair, many educated urban Chinese came to believe that the American culture, including but not limited to the political system, was superior to their own. So that's where this shining beacon on a hill notion came about for the urban Chinese. But at the same time, new Chinese immigrants started to arrive in America. And as they lived and worked in America, they started to understand, well, just like any system, there are shortcomings of their adopted culture and political system as well. They're coming to terms of all those the new aspects of their culture. At the same time, they become also very aware their own visible minority status in this country. In fact, I lived in the States for many years as well. I was officially called an alien by every document or officials I came across. That was the official title, alien.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And not only that, Chinese immigrants came from this perceived quote unquote enemy state. If we listen to sort of the Cold War mentality displayed by the Western government and media. So there's this conflictual feelings for their country of birth and the suspicion of dual loyalties that can really take a psychological toll on the new immigrants. So yes, this book I think encompasses all these tension, and the hope is, as a fiction book, it can provide a kind of narrative framework to talk about these very challenging tensions, and to talk about whether there is a future for multiculturalism in such a divided world. And I hope that's the power of fiction. I think in political punditry this has been talked about, and it often just evolved into like nasty arguments quite quickly.
Yeah.
But hopefully fiction can do that.
And what and again, no spoilers. I'm going to try and say this delicately, but what I loved was I loved how the book ended because and maybe I'll tell you this off screen so again I don't give away any spoilers. But after I got to the end of the book, I actually started Googling some subject matter that I was really fascinated by. And I learned a lot that I didn't know or hadn't really thought about, but your book prompted me to do that. So I just want to encourage everybody, read it. And when you get to the end, see how you feel about that ending. Cause I absolutely loved it. It was really meaningful to read it and then to do a little bit of a deep dive into a little bit more about that kind of an ending. So loved it. So.
Oh, thank you.
One of the things I really found fascinating about the book as well is this idea of home, because your characters all have a different probably perspective, or I said the two main characters would have a different perspective of it perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because Lynn was being sort of programmed to just know that she was going to one day go to North America, that she was going to be heading out at some point. But I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to know, what does home mean to the characters in the novel? And having yourself been born in one place and living in other places, what does it mean to you personally? Because I've heard from other people who have lived in many places that sometimes home is a kind of a nebulous thing
Mm-hmm.
for them. So can you talk about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, so let's start with the character. I think for the mother character, LeMay, despite her early obsession with America, I think because she never became an immigrant herself, she was the one who was left behind. So I think her home would always be, I guess, geographically within China. But more importantly, especially as she aged, her home is where her daughter and her granddaughter are. For Lynn, it's a lot more complicated than that because she had lived extensively in both China and North America. And we can tell from the book, she was not exactly at home in either place. And as you said, at the end of the book, we do see her.
I know.
This is my own spoiler. We do
Yeah.
see her returning to China, maybe temporarily, we don't know. and she seemed a bit more at peace with herself. But I think there was still I hope, a pretty clear, sinister note lurking in the background in the final page of the book, because she is returning to a country that's still lacking liberty and freedom of speech. She is aware she's living in this imagined bubble which can burst anytime, but having gone through her solo immigration, she just has to kind of hold on to that sense of belonging for a precious moment. I think that sense of danger and brittleness is something she may never escape. That's just the reality of her world. This does mirror to some extent of my own experience. To me, the concept of home remains quite fractured. I think there perhaps will always be moments when I feel somewhat rootless or unmoored, but I think I am pretty lucky, and increasingly I do feel I have a tangible home. It's comprised of a small but life-giving circle of family and friends. I have reading, writing practice that keeps me anchored. And also this, I think I'm having a more and more reflections, and I have increasingly accepting myself, and that mindset is also a very key element of home. So it is still nebulous, but it's getting more tangible.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so fascinating. Yeah, I love that. That's a great answer. Now, I did want to throw something out to you as well, just to ask, what do you hope readers take away from your novel? Is there I know some authors will say, just let them read it. And then others will say, I want them to get this. So do you have something you want us to take away from the novel?
Yeah, so I think we touch upon a few points. One is I really hope people can start thinking about other people's experiences, people who may be alien to them, especially immigrants who are coming from these cultural, maybe even religious backgrounds that they themselves are not familiar with and perhaps feel just instinctively hostile about. I think this shared humanity is very important. And in the book, I did talk quite a bit about sort of this colonial mentality or internalized racism. I think it was a fascinating, underexplored source of internalized racism, because China was never formally colonized, but still people developed this ready mindset of worshiping the West. So I wanted to explore why that was the case and what was the implications. Yeah, so I hope the takeaway is really just to understand these other cultures better and understand the difficult tensions people in that culture face, and to have a narrative framework to talk about these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about the immortal woman that we haven't touched on today? Any other themes or anything that you want to just bring out to everyone to discuss?
I think your questions are very all encompassing. I, I love that you sort of hone in on the mother daughter component of this story, because ultimately it was a very, very personal story. I read Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Thien before writing my own book. And I found that book was such a sweeping tale of historical fiction. And I absolutely adored and loved that book. But then I also realized my skill sets and perhaps even personal interest wasn't exactly to tell such sweeping tale of historical fiction. I wanted to get into the sort of bodily and psychological experiences of one or two people and
Yeah.
just follow them and see where that takes me. So I think I do have a slightly different approach to this project, even though I am also writing about Chinese modern history. So I hope that is an approach that worked to some extent. I understand there's quite a bit of violence in this book as well. And I try my best to make sure it's not gratuitous. But I understand, different readers have different preferences when it comes to depiction of violence. So I do think this book can be potentially controversial, and
Oh,
I
okay.
hope people can be, open-minded when they approach these subjects and these scenes as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. I didn't feel that way about the violence. And I think it's because I was so enmeshed in the story
Mm.
that other aspects of it stand out more for me than that part of it.
Yeah.
So that's really kind of interesting. So yeah, I like that.
That's great to hear.
We really love sharing recommendations with our listeners. So are you currently reading something you'd like to share, or are there any titles you've read and really loved?
That's always such a hard question for me because a short list of titles, it's quite hard to come up with a very short list because just too many good books that I read and loved. So I think if we're talking about this particular book, I really think I owe this book to two books, maybe three. Okay, let's say three books. One is Madeline's Do Not Say We Have Nothing, I just mentioned. Then second is Celeste's Everything I Never Told You. And the third is Akhtar's Homeland, Elegies. These three books helped me think through a lot of the character development, even some of the plot lines, and just we share a lot of the sentiments around being in between cultures. So these three books are just so instrumental to the project of this book. But I'm also just constantly rereading and obviously reading new books too. So currently I'm reading, this is not a very short list. So
no, we love long lists. We love long lists.
Okay.
Go for it.
So just in the recent 2 months, I reread Gish Whose Irish collection. Always love that collection. Can always go back to it almost once a year. I love the novel by Jess Taylor called Play. Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. Just that book, Play with Structure, so elegantly. Love that book. I'm a big fan of Patricia Highsmith. So
okay.
I reread a bunch of books from her. In CanLit, I was reading Marc Ah-Sen has a book called Kilworthy Tanner. It was a very funny, slangy, raunchy book. Really love that book. Currently, I'm reading two books at the same time. I'm reading Thien's new title, The Book of Records. I'm also reading Galway's A Song for Wildcats. Both are really beautiful books.
I'm reading that one too, The Song for Wildcats. I just started that last night. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I haven't finished it either. In the middle of it. Yeah, so I guess that's my list for now, but I can go on and on. There are just so many books.
Now, I always have to say this to authors because when we're talking about your novel, it just came out. I always feel guilty asking this question, but I know we all want to know the answer, which is, are you currently working on anything that we have to look forward to in the future?
Yeah, so I am working on a novel. At this point, it's structured as a novel in linked stories.
I love linked stories. Oh my gosh, I love linked stories.
Yeah, as a reader, I love them too. But this is the first time I try my hands with it. I'm not sure it will work out very well, but I'm experimenting with it. So I can say is it's got tales from the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. It's got tales from the snowy mountains of Tibet. Also, there was one story about modern day AI sweatshop, but it does connect together, and the overarching story is actually a crime mystery. But structurally, it is closer to a collection of short stories and novella at this point. So I'm chipping away at it, have the first draft, but still very early days. So that's all I can say.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I hope that when it's published and we've read it, I hope that you will come back and chat with us about it.
Absolutely.
And yeah, Sue, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating discussion. And I just want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of The Immortal Woman by Sue Chang. Sue, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me today. Thank you.
Happy reading, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.